Welcome to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher, where we take you behind the scenes with peak performers to learn what makes them tick and discover how you can apply their lessons to your life. I'm your host, Molly Fletcher. Today's guest, Simon Sinek, has transformed the way we think about work. He's best known for popularizing the concept of why, which he described in his TED Talk, How Great Leaders Inspire Action. That talk is the second most watched TED Talk of all time and inspired his global bestseller, Start With Why. Now Simon is out with his latest book, The Infinite Game, which we dig into today. So what's the big takeaway? Many organizations struggle because their leaders play with a finite mindset in a game that has no end. In our conversation, Simon shares why leaders who embrace an infinite mindset build stronger, more innovative, and more resilient teams. I've been wanting to have Simon on the show since we launched, so I can't wait to share today's conversation with you. If you enjoy it, please take 30 seconds and leave a rating or review. Now let's dig in. Here's my conversation with Simon Sinek. So Simon Sinek, what a treat to have you on. You're a busy man. Thanks for taking a minute.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So Simon, most of our listeners, know your book, Start With Why. And everything you do is built around helping people wake up inspired to feel safe at work and return home fulfilled. So tell me, Simon, what in your own life, right, drove you towards this mission?
So I fell out of love with my own work. This is what happened to me before I discovered this concept of why. I woke up and didn't want to go to work. And yet, superficially, my life was good. And so I felt very embarrassed complaining that I didn't want to go to work or that I had no passion for what I was doing, because I sort of I had my own business. I had amazing clients. We did great work. How can I complain? And it was this journey that I went on and finding my why and rekindling and rediscovering my passion and really keeping it lit for as many years since then, that I came to the realization that this idea of loving our work is a right and not a luxury. Too many of us go out with our friends and somebody at the table says, I love my job. And the rest of us say, oh, you're so lucky, like they've won something. And the reality is we all get to love our jobs. And unfortunately, the idea of loving our jobs really is a luxury these days, but it is our right to love our work. And so I set upon this journey to help others discover their why and help inspire leaders to create a work environment in which that became the norm.
And your talk, Simon, obviously was a huge hit, right? When you sort of walked out on stage with your flip chart and Start With Why. I mean, 47 million views, I believe, at this point. When you finish that and you realize you deliver a message that had connected with people, what bubbled up inside you that said, wow, you know what, I've got a platform here that I can influence people in a really powerful way. This is cool. I'm going to lean into that. Tell me a little bit about what happened then.
Well, it happened long before that. I was already giving that talk for 3 years before I gave that TEDx talk. And, it's an organic journey. Mine is an organic journey. And I think this is what happens with anything that has value in the world, which is, it has value to you and it has value to your friends. And when you start sharing with other people, demand is created by value,
Mm-hmm.
If it's legit, as opposed to just advertising driven,
Sure.
But sustainable demand is created by value. And what made my work spread was not a marketing plan. It was because other people told their friends to read this book or watch this talk. And it really spread very organically. And I'm proud of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I, like I said, I don't think it wasn't some market research driven thing. It was because it was an idea that was very, very personal to me that sort of transformed the way I live my life and approach my work. That I know that my journey is very similar to a lot of other people.
And so, you've written a new book, The Infinite Game. And so I want to just rewind the tape for a second and ask you, did you, before that talk and during that talk and even post that talk, were you living in the infinite game in that moment, Simon?
I think there were definitely elements that were there for
Okay.
sure. The fact that I was so open to change, I think, is very much an infinite mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, People who operate with a finite mindset don't like surprises and like to have as much control over things as possible, which is why you see them operating with shorter and shorter timeframes, because we can control outcomes much easier when the timeframes are short. An infinite mindset embraces uncertainty and sees opportunity in the unknown rather than fear of the unknown. So I think I definitely set upon a journey that had no plan, but I knew the very distant destination. I knew that there was a vision of the future that I wanted to live in that didn't exist, a world in which people feel inspired, safe, and fulfilled. And so, yeah, I think looking back, I guess there were some elements.
Mm-hmm. And so I want to dig into the infinite game a bit. I have really enjoyed this book. It's powerful. It's really powerful. Was there something in your own journey, Simon, along the way that inspired you to write this particular book?
Of course, I mean, all of my work is semi-autobiographical. It is my journey, which turns out is very similar to a lot of people's journeys. I had discovered this little book, Finite and Infinite Games, written by a philosopher and theologian named James Carse. A friend of mine gave it to me. It was written back in the mid '80s, and it's in that book that he defines these two kinds of games: finite games and infinite games. A finite game is defined as known players, fixed rules, and agreed upon objectives. Like baseball or football, there's always a beginning, middle, and end. And if there's a winner, there has to be a loser. And then you have an infinite game. An infinite game is defined as known and unknown players. The rules are changeable, which means we can play however we want. And the objective is to perpetuate the game, to stay in the game as long as possible. We are players in infinite games every day of our lives. You can't be number one in your marriage. There's no such thing as winning global politics or winning education, and there's definitely no such thing as winning business. But if you listen to the language of so many leaders, they talk about being number one, being the best, or beating their competition. Based on what? Based on what agreed upon objectives, based upon what agreed upon timeframes. And so when I discovered this work, I recognized that I too was playing with a finite mindset, and it wasn't working. Because when we play with a finite mindset in an infinite game, it hurts trust, it hurts cooperation, and it definitely hurts innovation. And so I recognized that a change needed to happen. What's more, as my work started to progress and my vision started to clarify, people said that I was a crazy idealist. People, would say things to me like, you don't understand business. And yet so many of us go to work with this uncomfortable feeling that there has to be a better way. This can't be the right way to run a company. And yet we're told, you don't understand business. I think we know better. And we're being told these things by people who have much more success, much more money, and much more power than we do. So we kind of keep those uncomfortable feelings to ourselves and get about our work. Well, it turns out those uncomfortable feelings that I and so many of us have is actually grounded in something very, very real, which is the people who are running the companies that make us feel uncomfortable. They don't understand how business works. They're the ones playing with the finite mindset in a game that has no finish line.
Mm-hmm.
And so this, for me, was a huge weight off my shoulders, that it turns out that those uncomfortable feelings were telling me something, that all of us have that uncomfortable feeling that is telling us something. And we actually do understand business a lot better than we think we do. And the world is infinite. So writing this book was more of a rallying cry that the change that we want is actually the change that's good and right, and ironically better for business.
And so for our listeners, maybe you can give some examples of the language that we hear all the time that sort of illustrates, right, this finite mindset. So people listening can say, I see it. I'm recognizing this finite mindset now. And in turn, how do they make that shift to the infinite mindset?
Well, I mean, it's all around us. It's like, for example, the whole shareholder supremacy nonsense, where we prioritize the wants, needs, and desires of a disinterested external constituency over the wants, needs, and desires of our employees and our customers. Mm-hmm. That's like a coach trying to build a great team by taking advice from the fair-weathered fans rather than listening to the players. That's what that is. Like, that's madness. That's a finite mindset. The fact that we run businesses in months and not years, quarter to quarter, is absolutely a finite mindset. The fact that we reward people solely because they hit arbitrary projections on arbitrary dates and yet we ignore the people who may be building great teams and who are naturally great leaders. That is a finite mindset. Rank and yank, which was pioneered by Jack Welch and those like him, where we promote the top 10% of performers and we fire the bottom 10% of performers. This is all finite mindset. The ability to try and control things, shorter time frames, not stop spending on R&D and yet pretending that you're an innovative company. All of these things are common indicators of a finite mindset run rampant. Ethical fading, which we see too much in businesses today, in the extreme. You see it at places like Wells Fargo, where they opened 3.5 million fake bank accounts just so they could hit their quarterly numbers. These kinds of things. Having a pharmaceutical company raise the price on an essential drug by 1,000%. It's not illegal, but my gosh, it's unethical.
Right, sure.
But all of these kinds of things, those are extreme examples, but we see it all the time in business. Mm-hmm. And these are all examples of a finite mindset. So some things that we can do to embrace an infinite mindset, I break down 5 of them in the book: having a just cause, building trusting teams, respecting our worthy rivals, having a capacity for existential flexibility, and having the courage to lead. I'll just talk about one of them, which I think is the one I get the most questions about, and I actually think it's the easiest one to embrace, is this idea of worthy rivalry. Mm-hmm. We think we have competitors in business, but that's not true, because competitors only exist in finite games, because competitors are other players that we want to beat, mm-hmm. right?
Sure.
And you can't beat another player in an infinite game because there's no finish line and there's no agreed upon way in which we keep score. And if you're number one, you're only number one for now. So the whole thing is arbitrary. So to adjust our mindset away from having competitors and rather seeing the other players in the game as rivals, of which some of those rivals are worthy of comparison. And what that means is that their strengths reveal to us our weaknesses. We've all had experiences, for example, on a personal level, where someone we work with gets a promotion and we got angry. Mm-hmm. Think about that for a second. Mm-hmm. We got angry at someone else's good fortune. Well, the likelihood is because there's something about them that sort of touches us in a wrong way. It sort of makes us feel uncomfortable. And it's probably because there's something that person can do really well that we do really badly. And that discomfort is focused in a competitive spirit rather than taking a hard look at ourselves and saying, where can I improve? Now, we don't have to like that person or agree with that person, but we can learn from that person. And the same goes for companies. Every company has another company out there that other people constantly raise. Airlines are tired of being asked about Southwest Airlines, and computer companies are tired of being compared to asked about Apple. And it makes them uncomfortable, and sometimes they get angry when those companies are raised. Well, maybe there's something that those companies are doing that's better than you, mm-hmm. and maybe you can learn from them instead of constantly trying to beat them. And we've seen this play out in the real world. Steve Ballmer, the former CEO of Microsoft, was obsessed with beating Apple. And he was so fixated on beating Apple back in the days when the Zune, which was Microsoft's version of the iPod, was out. All they wanted to do was make a better multi-MP3 player than Apple. And that was his obsession. Well, Apple wasn't trying to compete with Microsoft. Apple was trying to compete with themselves. And so Apple had already moved on to the iPhone, which rendered all of the MP3 players obsolete. So this fixation on trying to beat our competition sometimes makes us very, very myopic to the world that exists, rather than seeing all the opportunity and ways in which we can improve the work that we're doing.
Well, and I've heard you talk about, when you talk about a worthy rival, and I know you were very intentional about the selection, right, of that word worthy rival, and you talk about how you had someone in your life like that. And what you did instead, what you used to do with sort of this finite mindset with this gentleman, yeah. and then what you shifted to. Maybe you can tell that story to our listeners, because they can hopefully, lift it up and apply it to something in their own lives.
Yeah, I mean, there was another person out there who does what I do. He writes books, he gives talks. His work is extremely well respected. I respect his work too. And yet I had this irrational hatred of him. I couldn't explain it. He was always very nice to me when I met him professionally. And yet I was very, very competitive with him. And I would regularly go online and check my book rankings and immediately check his. Mind you, I checked nobody else's, just his. And if I was ahead, I was smug. And if he was ahead, I was sort of a little bit unnerved and angry. Well, we were invited to speak at the same conference together on the same stage where we would actually be interviewed together. And the interviewer thought it would be fun if we introduced each other. So I went first. And I looked at him and I looked at the audience and I looked at him and I said, you make me extremely uncomfortable. I said, all of your strengths are all of my weaknesses. And when your name comes up, I get really uncomfortable. And he looked at me and he said, funny, I feel the same about you. The reason I had such a competitive edge against him or towards him had nothing to do with him. It had to do with me. Mm-hmm. It's because his strengths revealed to me my weaknesses. And it was much easier for me to take all those feelings of discomfort and channel them against him than they were to do the hard work of taking a look at myself and seeing where I can improve.
Sure.
The amazing thing is, since that cathartic experience, we've actually become extremely close friends and try and help each other out wherever we can. And by the way, I've never checked his book rankings or anyone else's ever since.
Good for you. So what are the consequences of leading in this world that we're in today with a finite mindset?
Well, when we play with a finite mindset in a game that has no finish line, we hurt trust inside our organizations. We hurt cooperation inside our organizations. Innovation suffers. Innovation requires experimentation, and experimentation, by its very definition, requires failure. And yet, so many of our organizations have become averse to any kind of misstep or failure because of the numbers they're trying to hit. And so innovations become mere features, benefits, and improvements rather than truly industry-changing ideas. We see it inside our organizations so often, unfortunately. The most finite-minded organizations, we don't really trust our leaders. We don't think our leaders have our backs. We kind of expect that if the company misses its arbitrary projections, that many of us are going to get laid off. It's not a meritocracy. It doesn't matter how hard I've worked or how long I've worked. I can expect to find myself, or my friends can expect to find themselves on a short list. And we're told by our employers, nothing personal, it's just business. Mm-hmm. Sadly, business is one of the most personal things in the world.
Sure.
It's about human beings spending more time with their colleagues than with their families.
Mm-hmm.
It's deeply human. We have insecurities and egos and expectations and fears and ambitions. Well, it's all work. That's all work.
Right. Sure.
And it's people who come up with ideas, not machines. And yet, when we operate with a sense of insecurity or fear, or that our leaders don't really have our backs, we become more risk averse, or we become more selfishly driven. Where if we're going to take risks, it's to self promote, it's to advance ourselves too often. And if it's not us, we definitely work with people who seem to exhibit that, which makes us not trust them either. So we may have some relationships, we may like the people we work with. But do we trust that they or that our leaders will be there for us in hard times or when we're struggling? Unfortunately, that's becoming less and less common.
Mm-hmm. So when you think of, Simon, somebody who is a leader who operates and behaves with an infinite mindset, so I'm sure you have thousands of examples. Well, maybe not thousands, but you've got some examples of people in your mind and people in the world like that. How do they show up? What are the behaviors of a leader with an infinite mindset?
There tends to be this wonderful calm. They tend to be very focused on their vision. You hear them talking about their vision way more than they talk about their competition. You'll talk about them advancing or doing something better rather than trying to beat someone else. They're comfortable with using growth as a dial rather than absolute. I don't understand in our modern day and age why we've all become obsessed with hypergrowth. Since when is hypergrowth, high-speed growth, healthy? Does that make for a good company? Of course not. It makes for good valuations, which is a business model of private equity and venture capital. That's the reason for high-speed growth. There's nothing that says high-speed growth companies are healthier. In fact, very often they're not. Mm-hmm. I like to think, the infinite-minded leaders see growth more as a dial. So, for example, let's say a retail operation has an ambitious goal of opening 200 stores in a year. They're a hyper-growth company. Well, they may discover that in trying to open stores so quickly that they're not hiring the right people and they're not training them properly. And so you're going to have 190 really badly run stores. That's not good for business.
Sure.
So rather, an infinite-minded leader is very comfortable to simply say, you know what, we're going to open 20 stores this year. They're going to be extremely well run and the people are going to be extremely well trained. And they take a longer term growth attitude because they believe in strong, stable, long-term growth rather than this hyper growth for no apparent good strategic reason.
So as a leader, if you maybe set quarterly goals, then would you just say those are sort of targets, if you will, Simon, and that you don't overlock in on those, that you want to just make sure you're waking up every day and sort of tracking toward those based on your vision? Is that what I'm sort of hearing?
There's nothing wrong with finite goals.
Okay.
An infinite game, an infinite mindset is not the absence of finite. It's the context within which the finite exists.
Got it.
And we overuse sports analogies in business, but the problem is sports has a beginning, middle, and end. A better analogy would be like exercise or health, which is you can absolutely have a goal to lose X amount of weight by X date. And goals are wonderful. They motivate us. They help us stay focused on something tangible, which is very important for human beings. They help us measure progress towards that goal. But that goal has to be in service to something even grander. So losing the weight is great, but I'm losing the weight because I want to be healthy. And if you hit the goal, that's amazing. You feel fantastic. But if you miss the goal, nothing really happens. In fact, even though you missed your goal and you might be a little bummed out, you're still way healthier now than you were when you started. And by the way, if you just stick to the exercise regime, you will hit your goal just a little later. That's a better way to think about how we should be leading our businesses. Yes, the goals are important. There's nothing wrong with quarterly or annual targets, but they're guidance. They're not absolutes.
Got it.
And those targets and those milestones should still be in service to something greater than growth. We want to hit that goal so that we can be the fastest growing company. Well, that's not a vision. That's just, I don't know what that is. So it doesn't serve any greater good. It doesn't serve humanity. It doesn't offer value to anyone. So goals have to be in a context of something broader.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting you talk about sports, and as a sports agent for years, at some level, I was representing people that were living in a finite game, right? And what's intriguing to me is that I think some of these elite athletes, the best ones, still operated more with a infinite mindset, right? So you hear coaches talk about the process, less about wins and losses, or the coaches that lean into just representing the athlete as a human being, not just the athlete themselves, more of the individual themselves. Or we have athletes who have a mindset of I'm going to be better than yesterday, that aren't just focused necessarily on beating the opponent. So I guess my question is, can you have an infinite mindset inside of a finite game?
Yeah, of course. Of course. I mean, remember, this is all contextual.
Mm-hmm.
When you're actually playing the game, if the game is finite, well, then the goal is to win. You can't have an infinite mindset when you're playing chess because the game will come to an end. You can't have an infinite mindset in the middle of your baseball game because it increases the likelihood that you're going to lose because there are only 9 innings. And at the end, if you are not ahead in the score, you lose. That's it. Game over. You don't get to keep playing.
Right.
But there's no such thing as winning career. Whether you make this amount of money or that amount of money, nobody will give you a medal for being the winner of careers. And at the end of the day, if your only ambition is to make more money, well, then when your career ends, when your sports career comes to a conclusion, then what? You're 30 something years old and you have no ambition to do anything bigger. And this, it's a very common feature in senior executives or athletes or Olympians that when they leave the game that they've become famous for, they suffer an identity crisis.
No question.
They really struggle.
Sure.
Because they spent their entire life trying to be number one, and then they move on and they don't know who they are or what they do without that definition of self. Rather, to use it as a platform for something greater. Curtis Martin, the former NFL football player, he's a great example. He was one of the greatest ball players of all time. Hall of Fame football player, but he never saw football or his career in football as the end all be all. He always saw it as a means to an end, which it would provide him the platform and the finances to go on and do better things to serve more people. And his life has been completely devoted to a life of service.
Mm-hmm.
And when he left football, he was immediately on to the next. There was no crisis. There was no worry. There was no, he didn't just become a sports announcer. he actually had a whole path of how to continue to serve, of which football was just one piece of his life puzzle.
Sure, it was a platform.
He operated with a very infinite mindset, still operates with a very infinite mindset.
It's here, my new book, The Energy Clock, and it's available online and in stores now. Do you ever feel exhausted and burned out? Do you find yourself giving your energy to the wrong people and the wrong things? Do you wish you had more energy for the things that matter most? Then pick up The Energy Clock and reclaim control of your life. I designed it to be read and implemented quickly. In about an hour, you'll learn how to perform an energy audit, stop wasting energy on the unimportant, and set your energy clock to focus on what matters most. Order your copy today and get access to exclusive bonuses like the Energy Audit and the 30-Day Energy Challenge. Visit theenergyclock.com for more information. That's theenergyclock.com for more information. So, Simon, what do you tell people who say, gosh, man, I love what you're saying, but I work inside of this organization that has a finite mindset. What do I do? How does that person help make that shift?
Well, you're not going to shift your company, and you're definitely not going to change the mind of your CEO, no matter how many, anonymous books you send them. The only thing we can do is control ourselves. And the opportunity is not to change a person, but to take a more infinite mindset means I'm going to be the leader I wish I had. I'm going to be the one who operates with an infinite mindset, who takes care of my team, and I'm going to ensure that they go home feeling that they can trust me, and that I can trust them. And I'm going to work to create an environment where they love coming to work, regardless of my rank. Even if I'm subordinate to someone, I can still work to be the leader I wish I had. And what you find is that team becomes higher performing, camaraderie goes up, trust goes up. One of those people will be transferred to a different team. They now take everything they've learned. They build a better team. And before you know it, the tail wags the dog, and we've completely transformed the company. In other words, if we take an infinite mindset and just be the leaders we wish we had, in time, we are the ones who will actually direct how the company will be led, and not the one or two people at the top who, at some point are going to retire or die.
Right. So control the controllables. Control what you can control.
Control what you can control. And because trying to control that which you cannot control just makes us totally frustrated.
One of the things you talk about in the book is trusting teams is one of the 5 components. Tell me, can you kind of break down the relationship between trust and performance?
Well, I had a conversation with head of training for the Navy SEALs, and I asked him the same question, which is, how do you choose? And he drew a graph for me. On the horizontal axis was trust, and on the vertical axis was performance. And the way they defined it was performance was how good are you at your job, and trust was what kind of person are you? And the way they put it is, I may trust you with my life, but do I trust you with my money and my wife? Translated into business terms, it would be, I'll definitely go into a new business pitch with you. I definitely have a meeting with you, but do I want to be stuck in an airport with you for 6 hours?
Sure.
They're not the same. They're not the same answer. And basically what he explained to me was, nobody wants the player in the lower left corner, the low performer of low trust, of course. And everybody wants the team member on the upper right corner, the high performer of high trust, of course. What they learned is that the top left, the high performer of low trust, is a toxic team member. And they would rather have a medium performer of high trust, sometimes even a low performer of high trust, it's a relative scale, over the high performer of low trust. And if you think about it in business, we have a million metrics for performance, and we have negligible to no metrics to evaluate trust. So we may have very high performers that nobody trusts that keep getting promoted in our organizations, and they eventually become toxic leaders because they only care about driving numbers and not about human beings. This, unfortunately, is such a common thing. And yet we have gifted natural leaders who are always there when we need help. They're always there to support the team. It's because of them that the team works to an even higher level, and yet they may not be our highest performers. And so they get ignored by the company. And that sends a message to the rest of the people in this organization, which is, if you want to do well here, be like the high performer of low trust and not like the high trusting person. And then we wonder why we go to work every day with people that we don't really trust.
Sure. Wow. Yes. One of the other of the five that I think is interesting is having existential flexibility.
Yeah.
And you talked about that inside of yourself, that was something that you had early on. Tell us, how do people show up and have the ability to have existential flexibility in order to live with the infinite mindset?
Well, remember, I talked about how the finite players fear uncertainty and the infinite players see opportunity in change,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
So very often what you'll see is as technologies change, politics change, cultures change, you'll see a lot of companies start to struggle and they'll double down on their business models as opposed to learning to adjust the business models.
Hmm.
Existential flexibility is the ability to make a 180 degree strategic shift in order to better advance the just cause. So, for example, why is it that Amazon invented itself and the e-reader? They invented the Kindle and not the publishing industry. Like, think about that for a second. How come publishing didn't invent the digital reader as technology started to get better? Where were they? It's
Right.
because they were so focused on selling books rather than trying to help people learn new ideas in any which way they could. How is it that Netflix invented itself and not the television and movie industry? It's because they were all protecting old business models. One of the funny stories is Blockbuster. Blockbuster was the only significant national video rental chain for many, many years. And as the internet started to show up, there was a new little company called Netflix. And if you remember, the way the Netflix model worked was you subscribed and you got DVDs in the mail.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody knew that streaming was coming, but the technology wasn't quite there yet. But the subscription model was the thing that we're going to have to do for streaming. And so the CEO of Blockbuster went to the board and said, I think we should experiment with subscription models. And the board would not allow him to change the business models. You want to know why? Because they got 12% of their revenues from late fees.
Oh my gosh.
In other words, they were more preoccupied with protecting what they had rather than recognizing that change was coming and they better shift. And so they went completely out of business, and Netflix now dominates and directs the television and movies today. It was their inability to make this existential flex, because it cost them in the short term. Whereas a company with the ability to make an existential flex understands that it costs them in the short term, but it's the right thing to do. And so when you see companies now, especially in publishing, panicking to go digital, that's defensive, not offensive.
Mm-hmm.
That's because they're forced to, not because they were prescient about what the future held.
Sure. Well, and obviously, I mean, first you have to have the clarity of the kind of shift you want to make, and then you make,
of course,
the shift. So walk maybe our leaders and our listeners through how do they begin to create an opportunity to recognize these moments and then lean into them?
Well, as I say, it's a capacity. Existential flexibility is not the daily flexibility you need to run your business.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about very, very, very significant, large strategic shifts here, of which most leaders will never have to do one in their careers,
Mm-hmm.
or at most one or two.
Right. Okay.
They're significant and they're rare. But it's our responsibility as leaders to prepare the organization so that future leaders may make that existential flex should they need to, which requires two things. There has to be a clarity of cause. In other words, that just cause, the direction we're taking our company must be crystal clear. And we have to have trusting teams, because we are going to put our organization through short-term pain. And we want people to say, I understand why you're making that change. That's where the just cause comes in. And we're going to hunker down. We're going to help figure this out, which is where the trusting teams come in. If we don't have one of those two things, or both of those things rather, then the change will seem arbitrary or shiny object syndrome, just chasing the latest shiny object, or reactive. And the team will panic, go into defensive mode. And some of them may quit out of thinking that the leader's gone mad. So you have to have those two things in place for the capacity to exist.
Simon, are there any tools or resources that you recommend that, leaders listen to, whether it's podcasts or apps or even products? I mean, things that maybe you do in your own life, where you've seen some of the best leaders, some of the infinite mindset and people in the infinite game do as leaders to continue to grow?
First of all, there's no such thing as a perfectly infinite-minded organization, nor is there a perfect infinite-minded leader. But the thing that I've seen in common of the ones that seem to get it better, they're insatiably curious. As much as they know that they don't know even more. And they may be the most senior person in these massive, massive organizations. And yet when you sit down with them, they lean in curious to know what you know that they don't. They're not the kinds of people who say, well, I think I know what I'm doing. Look what I've done. They don't necessarily agree with everything, but they take it all in. And so the most infinite-minded leaders are students of leadership. I mean, they read books, they read articles, they watch talks, they talk to each other about leadership. I mean, this is their favorite subject to talk about.
Sure.
So I think to embrace an infinite-minded mindset, we just have to be curious that maybe the way we think the world works is not the way the world works. Or maybe what got us here won't get us there.
Right.
It's really a sense of curiosity and open mind that is, I think, the most valuable thing any potential infinite-minded leader could have.
Well, and you're also saying that they have the courage to be a little bit vulnerable, right? I mean, they have the courage to ask questions to other leaders so they can learn.
Yeah, they have no problem asking questions that makes them look stupid, right?
Right, exactly.
And they're able to resist the overwhelming pressure to focus on the finite. And I make everything sound very, very easy about this infinite mindset, but the reality is it's very, very difficult. The pressures on us are overwhelming to have a finite mindset. The incentive structures in our companies, if you work for a public company, the pressures are even greater. Our own egos, our own ambitions, our incentive structures, everything is telling us play more finite. And so to maintain an infinite mindset really takes a lot of courage. And that courage comes from the quality of our relationships. I don't believe courage is some deep internal fortitude. I believe it's external. The reason you have courage to jump out of a plane is because of the parachute on your back, the parachute that gave you the courage. And it's the same for human relationships. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's that we will be afraid and do it anyway. And we do so because we have absolute confidence that there's someone there who says to us, I believe in you. I got your back. If this whole thing goes south, don't worry, I'll still be here. And that's what gives us the courage to act. The quality of our relationships.
Sure, no question. Relationships are integral. What would you tell our listeners, Simon, that are listening and going, I love it, I get it, I want to do more of this, I want to live more like this, that they maybe feel like they tend to be a little bit too finite? What are the 2 to 3, 4 things that you would say, go do this first?
I think the easiest one is to stop thinking of the other players as competitors and start the ones that make us a little uncomfortable. What is it about them that we can learn about ourselves? I think that's really, really essential. I think just recognizing that our whole understanding of how business works, is false. This concept of the infinite game is not really an opinion. It's a truth. It's like gravity. It's just the way the world works. There are games that we are players in where there's just no finish line. That's just the way it is. And so the way in which we engage in those things are different. Think about when James Carse himself talks about where the idea came from. And you think about when you play a game, you're competitive, you get angry, you get upset with yourself, you get angry at the other person. Sometimes there's accusations of cheating. Watch children play a finite game. There's screaming and yelling and accusations of cheating all the time, right?
Sure.
But then watch kids when they play, when they're doing something creative, when they're painting. It can go on for hours and hours and hours, and they interact nicely. And it's because it's an infinite pursuit. And business is the same way. Business is a creative product. It's not a baseball game.
So, Simon, we end with rapid fire. So I'm going to fire off a couple quick questions to you, and you just tell me what comes up. All right?
Sounds good.
All right. Are you a morning person or a night owl?
Night owl.
Introvert or extrovert?
Introvert.
First job?
I worked in the local patisserie in my town. There's a little French bakery that I worked behind the counter.
One book that made the greatest impact on you?
Well, Finite Infinite Games is pretty high up there by James Carse.
Sure.
I also think that Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning weighs pretty heavily as well.
Great book. One book every leader should read?
Those 2 books.
Okay, one book.
I think Viktor Frankl's book is the one essential book that everyone should read. I think no matter what you do, what business you're in, whether it's, I think Viktor Frankl's book is the most important book everyone should read.
It's powerful. A person you'd most like to meet?
I don't know. I think Winston Churchill would have been pretty cool.
A habit that has improved your life?
Making sure to take time out to think, to disconnect. So to free up my schedule, that's just time to to ruminate.
Mm-hmm. That's hard to do. It just takes discipline, though, right?
You know, we doesn't have to be 10 hours. It can be 1 hour.
Right.
I put an hour in my schedule, at least on a weekly basis. That's my time to do whatever I want. That can't be overlapped.
Mm-hmm. What's one thing on your bucket list?
I'd like to go to Patagonia.
Very cool. So the show's called Game Changer. So my last question is, who's a game changer that inspires you and why?
The folks who inspire me, a lot of people don't know their names. They're not necessarily famous or CEOs of, you know, they're not corporate titans. But many of them are people who put on a uniform every day and live a life of service. And they inspire me more than most people who wear a suit to work.
That's awesome. So Simon, thanks for helping spread the message to make the world a place where people wake up inspired. They feel safe at work and return home fulfilled. I have a lot of respect for your mission. It's awesome.
Thanks so much. And thanks for giving me a platform to help share my ideas. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, as always, for listening to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. There you can listen to previous episodes and leave us a review, which helps other people find out about the show. For more about me, visit mollyfletcher.com. Until next time, stay curious and be bold.